Hi, Misha here, and I've already been thinking about I need to do another AR-15 video, but I don't really have any new AR-15s to talk about. I'm pretty particular about the ones that I do add to my collection. But then last week I was talking with Henry at 9-Hole, and he was asking why people seem to have a negative attitude towards the M16a2, and he was lamenting how much he rather likes it. Of course, he recognizes it's not perfect, but he likes it. And I frankly didn't realize people had a especially negative attitude about it. I kind of thought it was part of the retro craze. So with that, let's do a tribute video to the Colt M16a2. So I've got a rifle here. This is an M16a2 upper on a Colt AR-15 lower. That's for the full size. And for the carbine, what's usually called an M16a2 Carbine, we've got my Colt LE6320, what you might consider a semi-auto version, a civilian legal version of a Colt 723 or 733, sometimes called a Black Hawk Down. And just so it's not just all here at the table, let's cut to some shooting footage and we'll talk about what makes an A2, why these came to be, the changes made. Some of them were definite improvements over the original M16a1, while others were questionable, let's say. Colt 6320. While the M16 might have had a bit of a rocky start, especially with the Marines in Vietnam, by 1967 and the introduction of the M16a1, it was really coming into its own. And there were several small but important updates made throughout the 70s. It was becoming a truly mature design. And 223-556 was well thought of after Vietnam, to the point that it was going to be a NATO standard. So between 1977 and 1980, testing was done to kind of pick a standard loading. This would become the 62 grain SS-109 round developed in Belgium by FN, the M855 later on. This would require a new gun in the USA. At the very least, a faster twist rate. The original M16a1 had a 1 in 12. The heavier bullet required at least a 1 in 9 twist. And really, if bullets like tracers were to be fully stabilized, especially in places like Alaska, it was decided that a 1 in 7 would be necessary. Now, they could have stopped there. They could have just taken the M16a1, put a 1 in 7 twist bore, called it good. But in January of 1980, the Marine Corps approached Colt not just to get a new model with the faster twist rate, but they wanted other changes. They wanted to improve the weapon's durability, because Marines. They also wanted to improve its practical long-range accuracy. And for whatever reason, they wanted to get rid of the fully automatic setting and go to a burst setting. Now, Colt had offered burst on various commercial models for years, so it wasn't revolutionarily new. But this was something the Marine Corps wanted. And they would do some preliminary testing in 1980, and it was decided that one way to improve durability and range accuracy would be to go to a heavier barrel. And from there, they would make several other changes towards their goals. And then in 1981, the Marines would test what was known as the M16a1 E1 with several changes. They liked what they saw, so in 1982, the design was finalized, and then it was adopted and type classified as the M16a2 in September of that year. And the Marines were happy, and they placed orders, and they started to receive their new gun in 1983. But originally, deliveries would be quite slow. Eventually, other branches would join in, but the Army was reluctant. They would not adopt it until 1985 and not start fielding it until 1986, and it would be a pretty slow transition process, with some units not turning theirs in until 1990 or even 1991, switching over to the A2 from the original A1. Now keep in mind, this is all before carbines were standard. This is before the M4. So we'll revisit that in a minute. So with all that, what does make an M16A2 over an A1? What do I consider to be categorically better features, and which ones do I kind of consider to be questionable? Also, here's a modern M9 bayonet because it looks cool and looks right with this gun. So the M16, what are you doing? No, I said we're doing an AR video. No AKs allowed. I don't care if it's even 80A's case. No. I do enough AK videos. This is about ARs. 56-2. Starting at the muzzle, we have a new compensator, and I would consider this to be an improvement. Unlike the A1, this has 5 slots with a solid bottom. So it still works as a flash hider, but the solid bottom makes it a basic, some might say primitive, muzzle brake or compensator to keep muzzle rise checked. But it costs nothing, and it does provide a little bit of check to muzzle climb. Also, not having the ports on the bottom means that you don't have blast from the muzzle kicking up dust, sand, dirt. Not a bad idea considering the next few wars would be fought in just such environments. Of course, it's still on 1/2x28 threads, so pretty standard there and interchangeable with the original A1 bird cage. So if someone wanted to put an A2 on an A1, they could, and vice versa. As for the barrel, this is more of a mixed bag. It does have the 1-in-7 twist. It is chrome lined. That is good. It's still 20 inches, which is more than enough to stabilize and provide maximum range and what have you for the cartridge. And it has the same bayonet lug and essentially the same front sight base, gas block unit, although of course the front sight itself is different for the A2. It even has the same triangular shape here as the front handguard cap. The barrel, though, is heavier, and it would be one thing if it were heavier from front to back, but it's not. Under the handguards, it's thin, like the A1. Now this was done, at least in theory, so that the 40mm, the M203 grenade launcher could be clamped on. Unfortunately, the handguard area is where heat would build up, chamber to gas port. So having a pencil barrel doesn't really help. Having thick out front is of very limited assistance. It might help if you're pulling down on the sling swivel, and help if you are trying to use your barrel as a crowbar. But on the other hand, having it fat up here and thin back here is a certain kind of imbalance. And of course it does add weight. So it's kind of a, Yeah. Now this is an original military upper, so this is fully marked and all that, as it should be. So the barrel, if I'm being generous, I'll say is a mixed bag. Now let's skip to the receivers. I should point out that with the A2, the 30-round magazine was made a standard feature. Before, 30-rounders were definitely used in the 70s, but 20s were pretty common. But as the 80s moved on, we'd see more and more 30s, and that was just kind of stanag. The lower is different, as you know. The front area where the pivot pin goes is reinforced right here. And the rear is reinforced here. Now, were these areas having problems on the A1? Not commonly, but I don't think the reinforcements hurt anything. And it is probably nice to have it here in the receiver extension area especially. And, you know, having the front pivot pin reinforced a bit. I don't see that as a loss. Moving to the upper, we have a new port door with a bit of a lip or ledge to it. That was done so they could easily be grasped. The A1 had a bumper there, but it kind of came in closer. This is easy to flick back up. No harm there. We also have a brass deflector, which cosmetically I don't think looks as cool as the slab side, but for a lefty, hey, it's nice to have, so probably not a bad thing. It also can act a bit of a gas deflector in some instances, but yeah. Now the forward assist was retained from the A1, boo, but it was made round, so a little more subdued from the teardrop. Now the early version was a larger round style, but soon they would go to the smaller type. So I don't really have a problem with these changes. I think they're, for the most part, good ones. However, now we come to the rear sight. This is more controversial, to say the least. As you know, the A1 rear sight had two quite large peeps and an L flip, kind of M1 Carbine style, and it had a windage adjustment, but it needed a bullet tip. It did not have any elevation adjustment down here. Well, since the Marines were interested in aimed, accurate, long-range fire, the peeps were made smaller, and the windage knob was made hand adjustable, thumb adjustable here. And of course we have this secondary knob for elevation here. This certainly adds complexity and cost, and when you do that, you're definitely leaving a sight open to be damaged. However, while that can happen, and I'm sure it does happen sometimes, I will say I think its likelihood is overstated. I've seen a lot of used M16a2s, and only a handful had damaged rear sights. But it is more possible than with the A1. It does add yet more weight. And of course, you can always have the soldier fiddling with it. But it definitely gets a lot of flack, especially from the Army. And I can understand why, although again, I think sometimes it could be a bit overblown. But that is, I would say, mixed bag, to say the least. But what the hell do I know? I'm blind. Hey, look, bayonet on the end. Hey, for those of us who had to live through the assault weapons ban, being able to do this, although it seems like a simple thing, it's just great. Plus, I really like the look of the M9 on the M16a2. It just fits the kind of heavier, blockier nature of the gun. Well, now let's talk furniture. As I said, the front end cap is triangular shaped, so A1 handguards could fit in A2, and A2 could fit in A1. And they actually carried over the delta shaped slip ring from the XM177 and other carbines. The A1 had a straight slip ring, but the carbines, even back in the 60s, had this delta shape. That's a good thing. It's a very good thing. It makes it easier. It's just better. And also just better, all these new handguards. For oh so many reasons. They're more ergonomical versus the triangular ones. Don't get me wrong, I think the triangular ones from the A1 are iconic for Vietnam, but these are better. They have better heat shields, they have better ventilation. They're made of a more modern polymer. They're more durable. They're not prone to having the broken teeth like on the A1 style. And whereas the A1 have a left and a right, these are fully interchangeable, top and bottom, but you can put either one on top or bottom, it doesn't matter. I definitely think this is just better. Hard to kind of say otherwise. Now the new pistol grip, that's more open for debate. They did get rid of the small sling loop on the bottom of the A1 grip. That's fine. No one ever used it. But then they added this thumb or finger groove or rest here. Some really hate that to the point they'll even shave it off. I guess if I had to pick, I do kind of like the A1 grip more, but this one doesn't bother me, truth be told. But if I had to pick, I guess I'd go A1. So handguards, definite positive. Pistol grip, ever so slight negative. But that's easily resolved. By the way, yeah, it's on a Colt AR-15 A4 lower, because there really wasn't a perfect AR-15 A2 government-style clone in the semi-auto family. Standard Selector would not have been ambidextrous. Let's talk about this briefly. Like I said, the Marines did want 3-round burst, not fully automatic. Of course, Colt offered both. The safe semi-full version was known as the Colt Model 701, and the safe semi-burst was the Colt 705. So in their catalog they had both, but the M16a2 became the burst version. The M16a3 was actually the 701 with automatic fire, but these were purchased in very small numbers, mostly by the Navy for use by SEALs. So there was a full auto version like the A1 available, but for various reasons, the military wanted the burst. And that's pretty controversial. And all in all, I would say, yeah, having automatic was generally better than burst. Less complicated, and once you had a soldier trained, kind of made sense. And our final piece of furniture, a buttstock. On the positive, it too is made of a modern polymer compared to the A1. We have a new checkered, or I should say fully checkered butt plate, whereas the A1 was only partially checkered. It too has a trap door for a cleaning kit, very similar there, fixed sling swivel. And it is 5/8 of an inch longer for taller individuals. For someone like me, not so useful, but considering Marines and most in the military are not short, that makes sense. That puts the overall length of the M16a2 at about 39.7 inches. So all of these changes definitely added weight. In fact, we're over 8.5 pounds with the magazine inserted. So a gun that was intended to be light is really kind of porking up a bit. But on the other hand, it is a 20-inch gun with a fixed buttstock. There were some internal changes too, a slightly more modern rifle buffer. Bolt group was virtually unchanged. Yeah, most of that, the gas system is standard length. Yeah, that stuff is pretty well unchanged. Most of your stuff is external and cosmetic. And again, it was made for the Marines, and they like it. By the way, the M9 also has a wire cutter and sharpener on it. Pretty standard stuff. Regardless, these were starting to replace the A1 in military service in the mid and late 80s. The first time they saw active combat was in Panama. They also were used in the Gulf War, and they were in service in 1993 during all of those events. And they would pretty much fully replace the A1 in the 90s. And they would be a standard, still very much in service and use at the beginning of I guess we'll call it War on Terror, 2001, 2002. So that was the A2 rifle. It was standardized, type classified, and it was locked in stone, essentially. It would be produced by Colt and also FNH USA for the US and allies. And it would be the standard until the Marines would replace it with the updated M16a4. And of course, the Army and others would replace it with the M4 and M4a1, which were carbines. And speaking of, what about this one? Now, like I said, this is a Colt LE6320 semi-auto. But in my collection, it kind of stands in for a Black Hawk Down carbine, a Colt model 723 or 727 if you like, or 733. They're a little fluid because of different features and things, because these weren't type classified. Neither were really the original Colts like the 609, 610, 629, 630, even later ones like the 653. In fact, the M4 was really the first one to be officially and fully adopted. Before that, they were experimental, kind of off-the-shelf guns. And Colt had determined through various means and reasons that a 14.5-inch barrel was just great. It gave the same dwell time as on the rifle, same distance from the muzzle to the gas block. Now this is a 16-inch barrel, so it is slightly stretched out. But most of your Colt carbines would be the 14.5, although 11.5s are still in production. And of course, it had the same carbine length gas system. Often this is known as an M16a2 Carbine, kind of the whole group collectively. And this one here has the pencil barrel, like an A1, but it's a 1-in-7 twist. And it has the A2 Compensator flash hider, A2 front sight, bayonet lug. It still has the slim Car 15 6-hole handguards. The M4 handguards would come later. Delta ring, reinforced lower, A2 grip, and it would have the Fiberlight buttstock, essentially the same shape as the Car 15 XM177 stock, but that was made of metal. This is now polymer. Originally it would be 2-position, in and out. Later they would go to 4. But interestingly, many of the carbines in this era still retain the A1 style of rear sight, sometimes called a field sight by Colt. Many often think of it as a Canadian C7 type sight. But on a carbine, this made more sense because you're not really wanting to shoot at 600, 700 meters. So having the basic rear sight does make sense, especially considering these guns were used by special forces like Delta and could be knocked around, and it was good for them to be lighter. But these were purchased in relatively small numbers, and they were used in Iraq and the first Gulf War. They were used in Mogadishu, Somalia. They were still in use even in Kosovo later on. But of course they would give way to the M4, really just proving how good a carbine was on the modern battlefield. But this one's a really neat one in the collection. I like it that these are kind of that transitional period in between the XM177 and the M4 series. Colt 6320. Just flipping it over. Again, stock originally was 2 position, later 4. It allowed it to be compacted a bit, under 30 inches. There's the bullet adjustable windage, standard, and standard brass deflector. These are really neat, very lightweight, mostly A2 features, but a few holdovers. Unfortunately, because of the 16-inch barrel, while you can clip a bayonet onto this lug, it's really going to rattle around this pencil barrel. If you think they rattle on a Colt LE 6920, try doing it on a like a Colt 6520 with the pencil. It's not good. Not really effective. But I just wanted to mention the A2 Carbine because while only a few were in service, much like the XM16a1 E1 before it, they were pretty darn high profile. So with that, M16a2, was it a winner or a loser? If you were to judge it by a modern 21st century standard, yes, it's kind of silly. But you need to judge it in the context of the time it was created in. The very early 80s. I would say most of the changes were either good or neutral. There's only a few that I think were negative. The longer buttstock makes sense most of the time. And again, if you need to, you can put a shorter A1 stock on it. Heck, later ones sometimes even had collapsing stocks put on them. That was approved later on. Kind of the same thing goes with the pistol grip. I get why the finger rest might annoy some people. You can shave it off or put an A1 on. Like I said, I think the whole handguard thing from the ring to the handguards, definite improvement. Compensator, improvement. The heavier barrel. Okay, that's pretty stupid. At least for the most part. I guess it's a little bit better if you're trying to use your gun as a pry bar, crowbar, but otherwise, leaving it thin under the handguards kind of defeats the purpose. On the other hand, the 1-in-7 twist, like I said, they could have gotten away with 1-in-9, like the Steyr AUG. But as it turns out, doing the faster 1-in-7 twist meant that later in life, the 177 grain and other heavy projectiles could be used. So it was kind of inadvertently a good step forward. Making the 30-round mag the standard versus 20. Good idea. Reinforcing the lower. Certainly doesn't hurt anything. Didn't really add much weight since this is aluminum. Forward assist. Not a big fan of it one way or the other. But if you have to have it, I do like this one more than the A1 because it's lower profile. Brass deflector doesn't look as cool, but it's nice that they're starting to have some thought for lefties. For the early 80s, it's better than a lot of guns. Also, sometimes it at least would have the tick mark and safe and fire markings on the right side, if not an ambidextrous. Again, the reworked port door, not a bad idea. Not at all. So I think there are 2 things that people think negatively of the A2. One is the weight. 8.5 pounds. Today's standards, that's very heavy. But in the 80s, a lot of guns weighed that. It was a little heavier. I think it's unfortunate. I like how light and handy the A1 is. But I do have to admit, at least there is some gain. You do have stronger furniture and a stronger receiver. I don't think it is a good thing, but keeping in mind the day and time this was made in, it wasn't egregiously heavy. Now the rear sights, I can't help you with that, frankly. That's a debate. I think it's more of a use a role thing. For the Marines, probably made sense. For someone kind of needing this as a de facto DMR, why not? As is famously known, these sights were originally actually made for the Colt LMG, the light machine gun version, and they were just kind of carried over. I will say that the Army actually trialed some optics versions mounted with like 3 power scopes around 1985, 1986. These were known as the M16a2 E1, but for whatever reason they decided that it wasn't workable. So they did consider going to optics in the Army back in the 80s, but I don't think the technology was quite there yet. Batteries weren't really durable and long-lasting enough, and it worked as far as pure glass for things like the AUG, but keep in mind the Bundesheer, much smaller military than the U.S., so they could afford to splurge a little more. To try to re-equip the whole U.S. Army with optics as a standard in the 80s may have just not been practical enough. Either way, the Army did consider it and decided just to kind of stick with this. Now, it has to be said theirs were typically mounted up here, although they did have a rail version they looked at too. Of course, this would lead to the Canadian C7, which would eventually come back around to the Weaver and then the Picatinny compatible, the 1913 compatible versions, a la the M16a4. It just seems like at the time the A2 was being created, optics and optics mounting just wasn't quite mature enough yet. It needed to wait to the mid or late 90s to get there. So yeah, I'm not going to solve the sight thing here and now. I do acknowledge that it adds cost and complexity and is more easily damaged compared with the A1 sight we see on this Carbine, but at the same time I think how easy it is to damage this rear sight might be overstated. It seems to have been good enough. AR-15A4. Good old AR strong. At the end of the day, I like the M16A2. I grew up shooting an SP1, so that style was kind of very familiar, but also kind of old hat to me. This was the new current military look in the 80s and 90s, and there's a certain allure to having a version of the military's current gun. So even though we've progressed past it, and this is definitively a retro gun, there is that part of me that still looks back very nostalgically to it. And if you don't want to run optics, if you do want to do iron sight shooting today, this is a pretty good military type iron sight. It's solidly mounted on the frame, fully adjustable back here, adjustable on the front. The rifle length gas is very soft shooting. Again, the 20-inch barrel is going to give you nice performance with the cartridge. I've always found the M16 buttstock A1 or A2 to be comfortable. I like the straight inline recoil impulse it has, and I always thought it was neat that it had a pretty darn generous storage compartment inside. Good use of space. Heck, I never even minded this simple but effective 2-point sling. And of course, it takes standard mags that are still cheap and available to this day. So, yeah, I think most of the changes were good for that day and time. And don't be ashamed to still love the A2, Henry. It's a pretty cool gun. If nothing else, it's got a lot of historical nostalgia cool points on it. This is mine. Like I said, I picked up the upper a long time ago. And I just put it with a Colt lower because none of the sporter versions were quite right. Either they had too heavy of a barrel or they didn't have the bayonet lug. Yeah, so I just kind of put this one together using Colt parts. This one up here, as I've said in past videos, it came in as police surplus. They were never sold commercially. Perfectly legal. It's semi-auto. But it's so cool, lightweight, and handy. And it's one I'm quite happy to shoot. But I haven't done an AR video for you fine folks in a while, so there you go. What do you think? Do you like the M16A2? Do you prefer the M16A1? Or maybe you think full-length rifles are silly and you are a pure carbine person? Let us know in the comments. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel this holiday season, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. And soon to be happy holidays. Be here next time.